The lawyer's words hit me like a slap across the face. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chun, but your son has filed a claim stating the inheritance rightfully belongs to him as Wei's biological father." I looked that man straight in the eye and said the words that would change everything. "Li Wei, you walked out on that boy when he was 7 years old, and now you want to profit from his death." What happened next would expose just how far some people will go for money. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. 3 months ago, my grandson Wei passed away suddenly from a heart attack at just 30 years old. The boy I'd raised as my own son for 23 years. The child who called me Mama Lin and never missed our Sunday dinners was gone. While I was drowning in grief, planning his funeral, and trying to figure out how to live in a world without his laugh echoing through my house, I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Wei had been successful. He'd built a thriving tech consulting business, owned 2 properties, and had saved diligently since his early 20s. I knew he was doing well, but I had no idea just how well until his lawyer, Mr. Zhang, called me a week after the funeral. "Mrs. Chun, I need to schedule a meeting regarding Wei's will," he'd said, his voice gentle but formal. "There are some significant assets to discuss." I'd assumed there might be enough to cover his funeral expenses and maybe a small memorial fund. Wei had always been thoughtful that way. So when I walked into Zhang's office last Tuesday morning, wearing my best black dress and carrying the leather handbag Wei had given me for my 72nd birthday, I was expecting a brief, somber meeting about settling his affairs. What I wasn't expecting was to learn that my grandson had left me $4.2 million. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" I'd asked, certain I'd misheard. Mr. Zhang smiled kindly. $4.2 million, Mrs. Chun. The house in Riverside, the investment accounts, the business assets, and a life insurance policy. Wei was very specific in his will that everything should go to you. I sat there in stunned silence, thinking about all the times Wei had insisted on paying for dinner when we went out, how he'd quietly taken care of my car repairs and never let me reimburse him. Even in death, that sweet boy was still taking care of his Mama Lin. "He left a letter for you as well," Zhang added, sliding an envelope across his mahogany desk. Wei's handwriting was familiar, the same careful script he'd used for thank you notes as a child. "Dear Mama Lin," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. And I need you to know that every good thing in my life started with you. You saved me when I was 7 years old, and you never let me forget that I was loved and wanted. This money is my way of making sure you're taken care of the way you took care of me. Do something amazing with it." I was still wiping away tears when my phone rang. Li Wei's name flashed on the screen. I hadn't heard from my 44-year-old son in over 2 years, not since he'd sent a generic Christmas card with no personal message. "Hello, Li Wei," I answered, wondering if he was finally calling to offer condolences. "Mom, we need to talk about Wei's will." No hello, no how are you holding up? No acknowledgement of the child he'd abandoned. Just straight to business. That's when I knew this conversation was going to be ugly. And I was right. "I know about the money, Mom," Li Wei continued, his voice sharp with accusation. "Don't try to hide it from me. I have rights here." I almost laughed at the audacity. Rights? The man who dumped his 7-year-old son on my doorstep 23 years ago and disappeared into his new life was talking about rights. What rights would those be, Li Wei? I asked, genuinely curious to hear his logic. "I'm his father, biological father. That has to count for something legally." The silence stretched between us as I processed this. Li Wei, who hadn't attended Wei's high school graduation, his college graduation, or sent so much as a birthday card in the last decade, was now claiming paternal rights over his estate. But what really got my blood boiling was realizing how he'd found out about the inheritance. "Li Wei, how exactly did you learn about Wei's will?" There was a pause, and I could practically hear him scrambling for an acceptable answer. I called the funeral home to ask about arrangements, and they mentioned there was a significant estate." Lie. Complete lie. I'd handled all the funeral arrangements myself, and the funeral home wouldn't discuss financial matters with someone who wasn't the next of kin. "Try again, Li Wei." "Fine." I saw the probate filing online. It's public record, Mom. I was checking to see if Wei had left any debts I should know about. There it was. He'd been hunting for information, probably hoping Wei had left behind problems he could swoop in and help with. Instead, he discovered a fortune and decided he deserved a piece of it. You made your choice 23 years ago, I said quietly. You chose your new wife over your son. You chose your fresh start over your responsibilities. You don't get to claim fatherhood now just because there's money involved. I heard his sharp intake of breath. That's not fair, Mom. Things were complicated back then. May didn't want kids, and I was young and overwhelmed. I thought Wei would be better off with you. Better off? As if abandoning your child was some kind of selfless act. I remembered that awful day clearly. Li Wei had shown up at my door with 7-year-old Wei clutching his stuffed tiger, tears streaming down his little face. I can't do this anymore, Mom, he'd said, his suitcases already packed in his car. May and I are starting fresh in Denver. We can't take Wei with us. I'd begged him to reconsider, to get counseling, to find another solution. But Li Wei had already made up his mind. He'd kissed Wei goodbye, promised he'd visit soon, and driven away while his son watched from my living room window, asking when Daddy was coming back. He never did visit, never called on his birthdays, never sent Christmas presents. When Wei would ask about him during those first few heartbreaking years, I'd make excuses. I need to see the will, Mom, Li Wei said now, his voice taking on that demanding tone I remembered from his teenage years. And I want copies of all the financial documents. I'm going to contest this if I have to. Of course, he was, because Li Wei had never met a situation he couldn't make worse through sheer selfishness. You can contact Wei's lawyer directly if you want to contest anything, I told him. His name is Jian Zhang. But Li Wei, I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing here. Are you really going to dishonor your son's memory by fighting over his money? Don't try to guilt me, he snapped. This isn't about honoring anyone. This is about what's legally right. I'm his next of kin. Next of kin. The words made me sick. I was his next of kin in every way that mattered. I was the one who stayed up all night when he had pneumonia at 9. I was the one who taught him to drive, helped him with college applications, and celebrated every achievement. I was the one who held his hand in the hospital during his final moments. You know what, Li Wei? Do whatever you think you need to do, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. But remember this conversation. Remember that you chose money over decency, because I'll remember it, too. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet kitchen, looking around at all the little reminders of Wei's presence. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something other than grief. I felt angry. Good. Because Mei Chun had learned a long time ago that sometimes anger was exactly what you needed to fight back. 2 days later, Li Wei showed up at my front door without warning. I was still in my gardening clothes, dirt under my fingernails from planting the memorial rose bush for Wei, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw my son standing on my porch, looking exactly like he had 23 years ago when he'd brought trouble to my doorstep. Hello, Li Wei, I said, opening the door but not inviting him in. He looked good, I had to admit. Expensive haircut, designer watch, polished shoes. Clearly, life in Denver had treated him well. Can I come in? We need to talk. About what? About Wei. About the will. About doing what's right. What's right? I almost choked on that one. But I stepped aside and let him into my living room, the same room where Wei had taken his first steps, where we'd watched countless Disney movies together, where he told me about his first girlfriend and his dreams of starting his own business. Li Wei looked around with barely concealed distaste. You never changed anything, he observed. The same furniture, same paint, same everything. Some things don't need changing, I replied. Some things are perfect just the way they are. He missed the dig entirely, settling onto my old sofa like he owned the place. Mom, let's be reasonable here, he began, crossing his legs and folding his hands in his lap. The gesture reminded me painfully of Wei when he was nervous. I know you're grieving, and I know this is hard, but we both know that Wei's will doesn't reflect what he would have really wanted if he'd thought things through properly. I blinked slowly, letting his words sink in. Excuse me. Think about it logically. He was young. He wasn't expecting to die. If he'd really considered the implications, he would have wanted his biological family to inherit his estate. It's only natural. Natural. Like abandoning your child was natural. Like showing up 23 years later with your hand out was natural. I studied my son's face, looking for any sign of genuine grief, any hint that he was mourning the son he'd lost. All I saw was calculation. Li Wei, let me ask you something, I said, settling into my recliner, the one Wei had bought me for Mother's Day 3 years ago. When was the last time you spoke to Wei? His composure slipped slightly. What does that matter? It matters because you're sitting in my living room claiming to know what he would have wanted. And I'm trying to figure out how you'd know that when you haven't been part of his life. I sent Christmas cards, he said defensively. And I followed his social media. I knew what was going on in his life. Christmas cards, generic ones with his signature and nothing else. And following someone's social media wasn't the same as being present for the moments that mattered. Did you know he was afraid of thunderstorms until he was 14? I asked quietly. Did you know he played piano beautifully but quit lessons because he was too shy to perform? Did you know he volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday morning for the last 5 years? Li Wei's jaw tightened. Those are just details, Mom. Details. That's what he called the fabric of his son's life. The 1,000 small moments that made him who he was were just details to him. No, Li Wei. Those details were Wei's life, the life you chose not to be part of. And now you want to profit from that life you abandoned. He stood up abruptly, his careful composure finally cracking. I was 21 years old when he was born. I was a kid myself. I did what I thought was best for everyone. You did what was easiest for you, I corrected. There's a difference. Fine, he said, his voice cold. If you won't be reasonable about this, I'll let the lawyers handle it. But don't expect this to be simple, Mom. I'm not going away. After he left, I sat in my quiet house and thought about Wei at 21. He'd been in his 2nd year of college, working part-time to help with expenses, calling me every Sunday without fail. Even as a teenager, he'd understood responsibility in a way his biological father never had. And now he wanted to claim his legacy over my dead body. The legal papers arrived by certified mail 3 days later. Li Wei was officially contesting Wei's will on the grounds of inadequate consideration of biological family relationships and undue influence by a non-parental guardian. I read those words sitting at my kitchen table with my morning tea and, honest to God, laughed out loud. Undue influence? As if loving a child unconditionally and being there for every scraped knee, every broken heart, and every triumph was somehow manipulative. As if 23 years of showing up was a con game designed to steal an inheritance. I called Mr. Zhang immediately. Mrs. Chen, he said, his voice warm with recognition. I've been expecting your call. Yes, we received Mr. Li's filing. Are you surprised by this development? I asked. Surprised? No. Disappointed in humanity? Absolutely. Zhang chuckled softly. I've been practicing family law for 30 years, Mrs. Chen. Unfortunately, money has a way of bringing out the worst in people. But I want to assure you, Wei's will is ironclad. His wishes were very clear, and he was of sound mind when he made these decisions. What exactly is Li Wei claiming? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He's arguing that Wei's estrangement from his biological father was the result of your interference and that his decision to leave his estate to you was made under emotional duress caused by your prolonged manipulation of his relationship with him. I set my teacup down carefully, afraid I might throw it. Manipulation? Right. Because raising a child and loving them is manipulation. Mr. Zhang, I need you to understand something. These are serious allegations, even though they're completely baseless. We'll need to gather documentation to support our defense. Documentation. Evidence that I'd been a good grandmother. Proof that Li Wei had abandoned his son. It felt surreal, having to justify 23 years of love and sacrifice to strangers in suits. What kind of documentation? School records showing you as his primary guardian. Medical records with your name as emergency contact. Financial records showing your support of his education and activities. Any communication from Li Wei during his childhood that demonstrates his absence from his life. Communication from Li Wei. That would be a short file. A handful of Christmas cards with no personal messages. 2 birthday cards in 23 years. 1 awkward phone call when Wei was 16 that lasted less than 5 minutes because he didn't know what to say to him. Mr. Zhang, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. What are our chances here? There was a pause. Mrs. Chen, in cases like this, biological parents do have certain legal advantages, even when they've been absent. However, Wei was an adult when he made his will. He was 30 years old, financially independent, and completely capable of making his own decisions about his estate. But Li Wei's lawyers will argue that the parental relationship was damaged by your interference, and that Wei's decision was based on incomplete information about his father's circumstances. They'll try to paint a picture of a young father who made a difficult sacrifice for his child's benefit, only to be systematically excluded from his life. A difficult sacrifice. I wanted to scream. Li Wei's sacrifice had been choosing his new wife over his existing child. His sacrifice had been walking away from responsibility so he could start fresh without the inconvenience of fatherhood. What do we do? I asked. We fight, Zhang said simply. We document the truth. We show the court exactly who raised Wei Chen and who abandoned him. And we trust that justice will prevail. Justice. In my experience, justice was a luxury that most people couldn't afford. But I had Wei's inheritance now, which meant I could afford the best lawyers money could buy. And if Li Wei wanted a fight, I was going to give him one he'd never forget. Because he'd made one crucial mistake in all of this. He'd underestimated Mei Chen again. The first blow came when Li Wei's lawyer requested access to my financial records going back 23 years. Not just recent records, but every bank statement, every tax return, every financial transaction I'd made since becoming Wei's guardian. They're fishing, Zhang explained during our meeting in his office, looking for any evidence that you benefited financially from raising Wei. Benefited financially? I nearly laughed. I'd worked double shifts at the hospital for years to afford Wei's soccer equipment, his school supplies, his college fund. I'd driven the same beat-up Toyota for 15 years because every spare penny went toward his needs. Let them have the records, I told Zhang. I've got nothing to hide. Are you sure, Mrs. Chen? This level of financial scrutiny can be quite invasive. I'm absolutely sure. In fact, I hope they look real close at those records because what they're going to find is a woman who spent 23 years putting a child's needs before her own. But Li Wei wasn't done. 3 days later, he showed up at Wei's old workplace, introducing himself to his colleagues as his estranged father and asking questions about his relationship with me. He was building a case, painting a picture of an old woman who'd poisoned her grandson against his biological father. I found out about it when Wei's former business partner, Hao, called me. Mrs. Chen, I thought you should know. A man came by the office today claiming to be Wei's father. He was asking some pretty pointed questions about your relationship with him. What kind of questions? Whether he ever seemed resentful about his childhood, whether he ever mentioned wanting to reconnect with his biological family, whether you seemed controlling or possessive. My blood boiled. Li Wei was trying to rewrite history to plant seeds of doubt about my motives and Wei's feelings. How? I hope you told him the truth. I absolutely did. I told him that Wei talked about you constantly, that he credited you with everything good in his life, and that anyone who knew him could see how much he loved and respected you. That evening, I sat in Wei's old room, surrounded by the evidence of our life together, photo albums full of birthday parties, school plays, graduation ceremonies, family vacations, awards and certificates bearing his name, report cards with teacher comments praising his kindness and character. This was the real story of Wei Chen, not the fantasy Li Wei was trying to create. I picked up one particular photo, taken when Wei was 10 years old. We were at the county fair, both grinning at the camera, his small hand firmly clasped in mine. He'd insisted on riding the Ferris wheel, even though he was scared of heights, and I'd held him close the entire time, whispering encouragement in his ear. That's when I noticed something in the background of the photo. Li Wei's former neighbor, Mrs. Liu, no relation to him, was visible near the game booths. She'd been there that day because her granddaughter was in Wei's class. She'd seen us together, seen how happy and secure Wei was with me. More importantly, she'd also witnessed Li Wei's visits during those early years. The few times Li Wei had actually shown up, usually unannounced and often at inconvenient times, Mrs. Liu had been there. She'd seen Li Wei's awkward interactions with Wei, his impatience with his childish needs, his obvious discomfort with fatherhood. I picked up my phone and dialed information. If Li Wei wanted to play dirty, he was about to learn that I knew how to fight back because I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was defending Wei's memory and his wishes. And some battles are worth whatever they cost. Mrs. Liu answered on the third ring, her voice as sharp and clear as I remembered. Mei Chen, my goodness, it's been years. How are you, dear? I'm fighting for my grandson's legacy, Mrs. Liu, and I need your help. Mrs. Liu didn't just remember Li Wei's visits. She'd apparently been documenting them in her diary for years. I always thought that son of yours was trouble, she told me over tea in her living room the next afternoon. The way he'd show up demanding to see Wei, then act annoyed when he was actually excited to see him. And the things he'd say about you when he thought no one was listening. My heart clenched. What things? Oh, honey. He used to complain to his friend May on the phone right there in his front yard, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear, saying you were too attached to Wei, that you were making it hard for him to have a relationship with him, as if it was your fault he couldn't be bothered to call his own son. Mrs. Liu pulled out a worn journal, its pages yellowed with age. I started writing things down after the third or fourth visit. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. A father should want to spend time with his child, not treat it like an obligation. She opened to a page dated June 15, 2000. In careful handwriting, she'd recorded, Li Wei visited today, stayed 45 minutes, spent most of the time on his phone with wife while Wei tried to show him his school project, left early saying he had dinner plans. Wei cried after he drove away. Entry after entry detailed the same pattern, Li Wei showing up sporadically, interacting with Wei half-heartedly, then leaving him confused and disappointed. The visits had become less frequent over the years until they stopped altogether when Wei was 14. There's more, Mrs. Liu said, flipping to entries from 2003. He came by one last time when Wei was about 13. I heard him arguing with you in your front yard. I remembered that day vividly. Li Wei had shown up demanding I encourage Wei to call him more often, accusing me of turning him against him. I quote here, Mrs. Liu continued, "This isn't working, Mom. He doesn't even want to talk to me anymore. Maybe it would be better if I just stayed away until he's older and can understand the situation better." Mrs. Liu looked up at me. You told him that if he walked away again, he shouldn't expect Wei to be waiting when he decided to come back. I did say that, I admitted. I was tired of watching him break Wei's heart over and over again. Well, you were right. He left that day and didn't come back for 8 years. And when he finally did show up, it was for Wei's high school graduation. He stayed for the ceremony and left immediately after. Didn't even congratulate him personally. I closed my eyes, remembering Wei's face that day. He'd scanned the crowd looking for Li Wei, hope written all over his features. When he'd spotted him leaving early, his shoulders had sagged with disappointment. He'd never mentioned it, but I'd seen the hurt in his eyes. Mrs. Liu, would you be willing to testify about what you witnessed? She straightened in her chair, her eyes flashing with determination. Honey, I'd be honored to tell a judge exactly what kind of father Li Wei was. That boy deserved better, and you gave it to him. That evening, I called Zhang with the news about Mrs. Liu's testimony. This is excellent, Mrs. Chan, he said. Eyewitness testimony from a neutral party will be very compelling. But I have to warn you, Li Wei's team has been busy too. They've filed a motion claiming Wei suffered from depression and anxiety that affected his judgment when making his will. My blood ran cold. That's a lie. Wei was happy, successful, well-adjusted. I know that, and you know that. But they're going to argue that his mental state was compromised by the trauma of paternal abandonment and that his decision-making was impaired as a result. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Li Wei was claiming that his own abandonment of Wei had damaged him so severely that he couldn't make rational decisions about his estate. He was using his failures as a father as evidence that Wei's will should be overturned. Can they do that? I asked. They can try, but we have evidence of Wei's success, his stable relationships, his sound business decisions. We can prove he was mentally competent when he made his will. What happens next? Next week we go to court, and we show the judge exactly who Wei Chun really was and who raised him to be that man. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Li Wei had miscalculated badly. He thought he could waltz in after 23 years and claim Wei's legacy based on biology alone. But he'd forgotten something important. Wei had been loved truly and completely for his entire life. And love leaves evidence. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The courthouse smelled like disappointment and broken promises. I sat in the front row, wearing my best navy suit, the one Wei had helped me pick out for his college graduation. While Li Wei's lawyer painted me as a manipulative old woman who'd stolen a child's love for financial gain. Mrs. Chun systematically alienated Wei from his biological father, he declared, gesturing dramatically. She poisoned a young child's mind against the man who gave him life. I watched the judge's face carefully, looking for any sign of what she was thinking. Judge Zhao was about my age, with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd been listening to this nonsense for 2 hours without showing much emotion. But I caught her glancing at me when Li Wei's lawyer claimed I'd exploited Wei's vulnerability for personal enrichment. Personal enrichment? Right. Because working double shifts to afford his soccer lessons was exploitation. Because saving every penny for his college fund was manipulation. Because loving a scared little boy unconditionally was somehow a long-term con game. The audacity of these people never ceased to amaze me. When it was our turn, Zhang stood up with quiet confidence. Your Honor, we're going to show you exactly what kind of relationship Wei Chun had with both people in his life. Not through speculation or creative storytelling, but through documented evidence spanning 23 years. He started with Wei's school records. Every emergency contact form listed me. Every parent-teacher conference was attended by me. Every school play, every science fair, every graduation ceremony, I was there, and Li Wei wasn't. Mrs. Chun didn't just raise Wei, Zhang explained. She was his constant, his champion, his safe harbor in every storm. Then came the financial records. Li Wei's lawyer had wanted to see where my money went. Well, now everyone could see. 23 years of receipts, bank statements, and cancelled checks that told the real story: music lessons, sports equipment, summer camps, tutoring, medical bills, college tuition. Every penny accounted for, every dollar spent on making Wei's life better. But the real bombshell came when Zhang called Mrs. Liu to the stand. At 81, she walked to the witness box with the dignity of someone who'd seen enough nonsense to last 3 lifetimes. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity. She described Li Wei's sporadic visits, his obvious discomfort with fatherhood, his complaints about being expected to act like a parent. The child would be so excited when he came, Mrs. Liu said, her voice clear and strong. He'd wait by the window for hours before Li Wei arrived, and then he'd spend the whole visit checking his watch, taking phone calls, making excuses to leave early. That poor boy learned to stop expecting much from him. I saw Li Wei flinch when Mrs. Liu described the last visit when Wei was 13. I heard Li Wei tell Mei that maybe it would be better if he just stayed away until Wei was older, she said. He was tired of pretending to be interested in his life. The courtroom was dead silent. Li Wei's face had gone pale, his lawyer frantically scribbling notes. But then Judge Zhao asked the question I'd been dreading. Mrs. Liu, in your opinion, did Mrs. Chun ever discourage Wei from having a relationship with his father? Mrs. Liu looked directly at me, then at Li Wei, then back at the judge. Your Honor, Mei Chun bent over backwards to help that child maintain hope for his father's love. She made excuses for Li Wei's behavior, helped Wei write letters that went unanswered, and encouraged him to call on birthdays and holidays. If anything, She enabled Li Wei's neglect by protecting Wei from the full truth of his father's indifference. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, justice might actually prevail. The second day of testimony brought character witnesses. Wei's business partner, Hao, took the stand first, describing a man who was generous, thoughtful, and deeply grateful for his upbringing. Wei talked about his grandmother constantly, Hao testified. He called her his hero, his inspiration, the person who taught him everything important about life. Then came Wei's college roommate, his neighbor, his pastor. One by one, they painted a picture of a man who was proud of his relationship with me, who spoke of me with deep affection and respect. Not one of them had ever heard Wei express resentment about his childhood or regret about his father's absence. But Li Wei's team wasn't giving up. They called Dr. Su-Jin Park, a psychologist who specialized in abandonment trauma. Children who experience paternal abandonment often develop complicated psychological defenses, she explained in clinical terms that made my skin crawl. They may idealize their primary caregiver while rejecting their biological parent as a form of self-protection. Self-protection? As if Wei's love for me was some kind of psychological disorder rather than the natural result of 23 years of mutual devotion. Dr. Park had never met Wei, never spoken to him, never observed our relationship, but apparently her textbook theories were supposed to override the testimony of people who'd actually known him. In your professional opinion, Li Wei's lawyer asked, could Wei's decision to exclude his biological father from his will have been influenced by unresolved abandonment trauma? Absolutely, Dr. Park replied without hesitation. Adult children of abandonment often make decisions designed to punish the absent parent, even when those decisions aren't in their own best interest. I wanted to stand up and scream. Wei's will wasn't about punishing Li Wei. It was about honoring the person who'd actually been present for his life. But I forced myself to stay calm, to trust in Zhang's plan. And when it was our turn for cross-examination, Zhang destroyed Dr. Park's credibility with surgical precision. Doctor, you never met Wei Chun. Correct. You never interviewed anyone who knew him personally. No, but I reviewed the case files and... You reviewed legal documents prepared by lawyers, not medical or psychological evaluations of the actual person in question. That's correct. But... So your entire testimony is based on theoretical assumptions about a man you never met, who died before you were even involved in this case. I'm applying established psychological principles to the available evidence. Zhang smiled coldly. Doctor, are you aware that Wei Chun volunteered weekly at a children's shelter? That he mentored troubled teenagers? That he donated anonymously to several charities focused on family reunification? Dr. Park shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't aware of those specifics. Are those the actions of someone consumed by abandonment trauma and motivated by revenge against his biological father? The psychologist had no good answer for that. Because Wei's life had been defined by love and generosity, not trauma and resentment. He'd been shaped by my values, not damaged by Li Wei's absence. And slowly, I could see the jury recognizing that truth. But then Li Wei himself took the stand, and I realized the real battle was just beginning. Because my son had always been good at playing the victim, and 23 years of practice had only made him better. Li Wei's performance on the witness stand was masterful. He dressed carefully in a simple gray suit, no tie, his hair neatly combed to make him look younger and more vulnerable than his 44 years. When his lawyer asked about giving up Wei, actual tears appeared in his eyes. I was 21 when Wei was born, he said, his voice trembling with perfectly calculated emotion. His mother had already left, and I was working 2 jobs just to afford our tiny apartment. When I met Mei, she offered me stability, security, a chance to build a real life. But she couldn't take on someone else's child. Someone else's child. Not my son or Wei, but someone else's child, as if Wei had been a piece of furniture he couldn't fit in his new apartment. But Li Wei wasn't done with his sob story. I thought Wei would be better off with my mother, he continued, dabbing at his eyes with a tissue. She had a stable home, financial security, time to devote to raising a child properly. I was barely more than a child myself. I made what I thought was the best decision for everyone. The jury was eating it up. I could see it in their faces, the sympathy, the understanding for a young father who'd made a difficult choice. They were buying his narrative that giving up Wei had been an act of selfless love rather than selfish convenience. Did you want to maintain contact with Wei? His lawyer asked gently. Of course I did. He was my son. But every time I tried to visit, it became more difficult. My mother had created this perfect little world for him, and I felt like an intruder. Wei would be polite but distant, like he was uncomfortable with me being there. Uncomfortable. Yes, Wei had been uncomfortable. Uncomfortable watching his father check his phone constantly, uncomfortable with his obvious eagerness to leave, uncomfortable with his awkward attempts at conversation with a child he barely knew. But Li Wei was spinning his discomfort as evidence of my interference. I realized I was disrupting his stability, he said, the tears flowing freely now. So I made the painful decision to step back and let him have the peaceful childhood he deserved. I thought maybe when he was older, when he could understand the complexity of the situation, we could rebuild our relationship. It was beautiful, really. He'd turned 23 years of neglect into a touching story of paternal sacrifice. He'd transformed his abandonment into an act of love. And when his lawyer asked if he'd ever stopped loving Wei, his answer was perfect. Never. Not for a single day. He was always in my heart, always in my thoughts. I just wanted him to be happy. I felt sick. This wasn't the Li Wei I knew, the one who'd complained about the burden of fatherhood, who'd chosen his new life over his existing child without looking back. This was a carefully crafted performance designed to tug at heartstrings and rewrite history. But Zhang was ready for cross-examination, and he had weapons Li Wei didn't know about. Mr. Li, you mentioned wanting to maintain contact with Wei. How many times did you call him during his childhood? Li Wei hesitated. It's hard to remember exactly. Several times. Let me help refresh your memory. According to phone records we subpoenaed, you called Wei exactly 3 times between 2001 and 2017. 3 times in 16 years. The courtroom went silent. Li Wei's composure cracked slightly. I sent cards and letters. Yes, you did. We have copies. 12 Christmas cards over 23 years. All store-bought with only your signature. No personal messages. No questions about his life. No expressions of love. Is that your idea of staying in touch with your son? Li Wei was crumbling now, his carefully constructed image falling apart under Zhang's relentless questioning. You said you stepped back to give Wei stability, but isn't it true that you stopped visiting because your new wife didn't want Wei in your life? That's not. May wasn't. We have your neighbor's testimony, Mr. Li. She heard you tell your wife that you were done playing father to someone else's kid. Were those your words? The devastation on Li Wei's face was complete. He'd been caught in his lies, exposed for what he really was. But then he played his final card, the one I should have seen coming. I may not have been the perfect father, he said, his voice breaking with genuine emotion now. But I gave Wei life. And May took that life and made it her own. She stole my son from me. And now she's trying to steal his legacy too. And with those words, I realized this fight was far from over. The bombshell came during Li Wei's redirect examination. His lawyer had one more card to play, and it was a doozy. Mr. Li, there's been testimony about your mother's financial support of Wei throughout his childhood. Did you ever contribute financially to his care? Li Wei straightened in his chair, and I saw something calculating flash in his eyes. Yes, I did, he said firmly. I sent money every month for the first 10 years of Wei's life. $500 a month without fail. $60,000 total over those years. My blood turned to ice. That was a lie. A complete fabrication. I'd never received a penny from Li Wei for Wei's care. Do you have records of these payments? His lawyer asked. Of course. Money orders sent through the postal service. I kept copies of everything. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. I brought them with me today. Zhang was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This evidence wasn't disclosed during discovery. Your Honor, Li Wei's lawyer replied smoothly, my client only recently located these records while preparing for testimony. They were stored in his late father-in-law's belongings. Judge Zhao examined the documents with a frown. I'll allow them into evidence, but I want both parties to have time to examine them thoroughly. We'll recess for 1 hour. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Zhang spread the money order copies across a table. At first glance, they looked legitimate, each one made out to Mei Chun for $500, each one bearing what appeared to be Li Wei's signature. The dates spanned from 2001 to 2011, just as he'd claimed. These are fake, I told Zhang firmly. I never received any of this money, not a single yuan. I believe you, Mrs. Chun. But these documents look authentic. We need to prove they're fraudulent, and we need to do it quickly. That's when I noticed something. The address on each money order was wrong. Not completely wrong, but subtly wrong. My street number was listed as 1247 instead of 1274. A simple transposition that would have caused any mail to be returned to sender. Look at the address, I told Zhang excitedly. He deliberately used the wrong address so the money orders would be returned to him uncashed. He could keep the receipts as proof he sent money while knowing I'd never actually receive it. Zhang's eyes lit up. That's brilliant. Evil, but brilliant. He's been planning this fraud for 23 years, creating fake evidence of financial support that never actually happened. We had 1 hour to prove it. 1 hour to expose Li Wei's decades-long deception before the court. But I knew someone who could help us. Mrs. Liu had lived across the street from me for 40 years. If Li Wei had really been sending me money orders regularly, surely our eagle-eyed neighbor would have noticed postal workers attempting deliveries to the wrong address. Zhang made the call while I paced the hallway. Mrs. Liu, this is Jian Zhang, Mei Chen's attorney. I need to ask you about mail delivery to Mrs. Chen's address during the 2000s. I see. Yes, that's very helpful. Would you be willing to testify about that this afternoon? When he hung up, Zhang was grinning. Mrs. Liu says the postal worker on that route was her nephew Bao. He worked that route for 20 years, and he specifically remembers attempting deliveries to 1247 Maple Street multiple times during the 2000s. There's no such address. It's a vacant lot. He had to return dozens of pieces of mail marked, address unknown. We had him. Li Wei had spent 23 years creating fake evidence of parental support, building a paper trail designed to support his eventual claim on Wei's estate. He'd planned this long before Wei died, probably from the moment he learned he was successful. But when we returned to court, and Zhang called Bao Lu to the stand, Li Wei's lawyer objected vehemently. Your Honor, this witness wasn't disclosed during discovery either. Neither were your client's fraudulent money orders, Zhang replied coldly. Judge Zhao made her decision quickly. I'll allow the testimony. This case has taken some unusual turns, and I want all relevant evidence presented. And with that ruling, Li Wei's house of lies came tumbling down. Bao Lu's testimony was devastating. I remember those money orders, he said, his voice clear and confident. Same sender, same amount, same wrong address, every month for years. I tried to deliver them maybe a dozen times before I realized there was number 1247 Maple Street. After that, I just marked them returned to sender and sent them back. And did you ever successfully deliver money orders from Li Wei to 1274 Maple Street, Mrs. Chen's actual address? Zhang asked. Never. Not once in 20 years. Li Wei's face had gone white. His lawyer was frantically whispering in his ear. But the damage was done. But that wasn't the end of it. Zhang had one more surprise, one final revelation that would seal Li Wei's fate forever. Earlier that week, while preparing for trial, he'd been going through Wei's personal effects more thoroughly and had discovered something that changed everything. Your Honor, during our preparation for this case, we discovered additional evidence among Wei's belongings. Wei kept detailed records of his business dealings, including recordings of important conversations for his protection. One of these recordings is directly relevant to this matter. Zhang approached the bench with a small digital recorder I recognized immediately. Wei's voice recorder, the one he'd used for business meetings and important calls. This recording was made 6 months before Wei's death during a conversation with his estate planning attorney about updating his will. The judge allowed the recording to be played, and suddenly Wei's voice filled the courtroom. Clear, strong, unmistakably him. "I want to make sure everything goes to Mama Lin if something happens to me. She's the only real parent I've ever had. My biological father, Li Wei. He's reached out a few times over the years asking for money, but I've never had any relationship with him." The recording continued. "Li Wei claimed he used to send support payments when I was a kid, but Mama Lin never got any money from him. Not a cent. I think he was lying, trying to make himself look better. I don't have any relationship with Li Wei, and I don't want him to have any claim on my estate. He made his choice 23 years ago when he walked away. Mama Lin made hers when she stayed." But the most damning part came next. "I've saved copies of every letter, every email, every text message Li Wei has sent me over the years. Most of them asking for money or trying to justify his abandonment. I want my attorney to have all of this documentation, so there's no question about my wishes if anything happens to me." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Li Wei was crying now, real tears this time. But they weren't tears of grief or regret. They were tears of rage and frustration. His carefully constructed fraud had just been demolished by his own son's voice from beyond the grave. Zhang then presented a file folder containing years of communication between Li Wei and Wei that none of us had known existed. Letters asking for loans, emails making excuses for his absence, text messages that revealed the true nature of their non-relationship. Wei had been documenting everything, creating a record that would eventually protect his legacy from the very person who'd abandoned him. Judge Zhao didn't need to deliberate long. Based on the evidence presented, including clear documentation of fraud in the matter of alleged support payments, I find that Wei Chen's will accurately reflects his wishes and was made with full mental capacity. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation of potential perjury charges. The estate will be distributed according to Wei's explicit instructions, with all assets going to Mrs. Mei Chen. As the gavel fell, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Wei's death. Peace. Not just victory, but genuine peace. My grandson's wishes had been honored, his memory protected, his legacy preserved exactly as he'd intended. Li Wei left the courtroom without looking at me, his dreams of easy money shattered along with any remaining shred of dignity. He'd gambled everything on his ability to manipulate the system, to play the victim, and rewrite history in his favor. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. And Wei's truth was stronger than his lies. 3 months later, I used part of Wei's $4.2 million inheritance to establish the Wei Chen Foundation for Children in Foster Care. It provides educational scholarships and support services for kids who, like Wei, had been abandoned by their biological parents but found love with guardians who chose to stay. At the foundation's opening ceremony, I thought about how Wei would have loved seeing children get the chances he'd worked so hard to create for himself. And I smiled, knowing that his final gift to me had become my first gift to the world in his memory. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just living well and loving deeply, letting your actions speak louder than your anger. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, justice actually does prevail.